Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Today's session, this session, is on a very interesting book, which is Pakistan Statecraft, Geopolitics in Today's World. The author is Shahid Javed Barki. As just a brief introduction, he was a former caretaker finance minister, vice president of the World Bank, and has authored several books, most memorably on the Bhutto years, as well as Ziaul Haq. I would like to invite on stage Ahmed Rashid, another very sort of notable author who's written best-selling books on Afghanistan, on Central Asia, on oil and terrorism. A big round of applause for Ahmed Rashid. Please have a seat. And our next guest is Michael Kugelman, who I consider to be more Desi than American. However, as you know, he's a deputy director of the Asia program and senior associate at for South Asia at the Wilson Center. He's written 11 books as well. He's written columns for the New York Times, Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. And his expertise is in terrorism, water, energy, and food security. Another huge round of applause for Michael Kugelman. Thank you both for sparing time, I think, for what is also a very key conversation about Pakistan's future in the world. And this book provides a kind of blueprint, a lot of themes that I think are very, very relevant, even though I suspect the book was written at a time before this current round of political instability. So I would like to start from yesterday's attack, and I'd address this to you, Ahmed Rashid Saab. Yesterday's attack in Karachi on police, before that in Peshawar again on the police. Do you think the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan's tactics have changed? Do you think that their strategy has changed? And do you think that Pakistan perhaps was more hopeful, or the Pakistani state was more hopeful than it should have been when the Afghan Taliban came into power?
Well, Mullah, the leader of the Taliban, who lives in Kandahar, has said quite pointedly to his supporters and to the TTP that Pakistan is not an Islamic country. The people do not practice Islam in Pakistan. Now that kind of thinking and that kind of statement has obviously given the TTP an enormous boost that they reckon they are more legitimate than anyone else in Pakistan at the moment. And of course, for us, that is a very dangerous position to hold. But that's what it is. And there's no question that the TTP have sanctuary in Afghanistan. They're able to carry out these acts of terrorism, especially in Peshawar and the tribal areas, with impunity. We are somehow expecting that the police is going to defend us. The police is not a counter-terrorism force. It is a force to maintain law and order. Counterterrorism has to be done by the army, by special forces, and with a coherent policy. So we are using unfortunately the wrong forces to combat terrorism, and more than that, we are not really explaining what our policy is. Are we talking to the Taliban, or are we attacking the Taliban and bombing them? What are we doing? I think the chronic situation was reached by the former President Musharraf when he decided that, we will talk to the Taliban, but we will also attack the Taliban. And we'll pay them off, and that's what happened. And of course, it led to even more chaos than before. We still do not have a counter-terrorism policy and what it entails. We are not prepared to mobilize the public in support of a policy because there is no policy. So we have a long way to go in order to ensure that this struggle goes eventually in the favor of Pakistan rather than in the favor of the extremists.
Michael, I'd like to direct this question to you with a slight twist. As Ahmed Rashid Saab said, Pakistan does not seem to have a counterterrorism policy. But up until 2016, 17, until 18, I would say, it seemed that Pakistan was heading in some kind of direction. So I'd like to sort of redirect this question to you, and then we'll go back to the book, because the book talks about Pakistan's difficult neighbors. It talks about the youth pulse. It talks about security and terrorism, Islamophobia. But I do think that this particular yesterday's attack sort of really sharply brings into focus Pakistan's challenges along its borders. Michael.
So first of all, Amber, it's great to be here. It's an honor. So I think that, you know, the resurgence of the Pakistani Taliban, it's not something that suddenly appeared in August 2021. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about how the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan galvanized the TTP and prompted it to start intensifying its attacks in Pakistan, which is true. But, I mean, you're right, that things had calmed down in terms of terrorism threats in Pakistan after the Zarb-e-Azab operation was launched and concluded. And indeed, that period, 2015, 2016 through 2021, was more peaceful. But, you know, I would take us back to a few years before 2021, when the TTP got a new leader. Its leadership changed. And this is something that we don't hear about a lot, but one of the first things that the new TTP leadership did was to bring back a number of splinter groups of the TTP that had split off. The leadership brought them back into the ranks, and that was a key turning point, I think, for the TTP, an early turning point for the TTP and its resurgence. That allowed it to draw on some extremely brutal splinter factions, including Jamaat-ul-Ahrar, which of course is the faction that claimed the horrific attack on the mosque in Peshawar several weeks ago. And we've seen some very interesting shifts in terms of the stated goals and tactics of the TTP, in that the senior leadership has claimed that they're more moderate than they used to be, that they only are targeting the state, they're not targeting civilians, they've minimized their links to Al-Qaeda and so on. But the fact of the matter is, these splinter factions that had split off and that had returned, they are particularly brutal, and I don't think they necessarily buy into this notion of a more moderate TTP, because Jamaat-ul-Ahrar was perfectly willing to stage that attack on a mosque, even though the senior TTP leadership claims that the group no longer carries out attacks on mosques. So I think that's some important context to keep in mind, looking at how things have gradually gotten worse on the terrorism front, and it goes back quite a few years. It didn't only start in August 2021.
Thank you, Michael. Ahmed Rashid Saab, the book is hopeful, as I said, and it really places or sees hope in terms of Pakistan's leadership on many global trends and issues such as climate change, Islamophobia, an example of democratic development in the Muslim world, and how Pakistan can leverage its youth bulge as well. Do you see that hope as unrealistic given the moment in time that we're in right now? And what do you think are the challenges towards that sort of global leadership position?
Well, you know, unfortunately, I think it's quite stunning, and this has never happened before in this country, despite its long record of political failure. Nobody is willing to talk to the next guy. The opposition is not willing to talk to the government, and vice versa. We have narcissistic leaders who claim that the masses owe them a big favor by marching with them, voting with them. But in reality, these leaders are not prepared to do anything for the country, which at this point in time desperately needs some kind of joint action, especially on the economic front. You're not going to get any movement on the economy unless you do it together. Nobody trusts a single government in Pakistan now, whether it's the Arabs or the IMF or the World Bank or anyone. They want to see a collective joint action from the Pakistani political leadership and military leadership to deal with the present crisis. But nobody's prepared to do that. I mean, even today, after all these attacks, we are seeing that, you know, the PTI is breaking up, that Nawaz Sharif camp is in the doldrums, is also breaking up. There are factions within factions. Nobody is willing to compromise or deal with the real problem. And as long as this continues, unfortunately, we're not going to get out of this present crisis.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that. You said nobody's talking to each other. There's obviously a trust deficit. There's splinters within parties, or at least groupings within parties. Do you think that Pakistan's domestic politics now dominates or will actually, and this was a question I sort of kept for the end, but because you brought it up, I'd really like sort of your response to this. But do you think Pakistan's domestic politics is now the burden or the weight that prevents Pakistan from moving forward?
Well, I mean, I think there are three major issues which are of equal importance. Obviously, there's a complete domestic political deadlock that has not moved at all in the last 1 year. There is also an economic crisis that Pakistan has never seen before of such magnitude, inflation at nearly 40%, etc. And thirdly, don't underestimate the terrorism factor. The fact that 100 policemen were killed on a single day. I mean, in any other country, this would lead to a reopening of consideration as to what on earth is going on. And in Pakistan, it's hardly made a dent. Suddenly, the 100 policemen who were killed have disappeared from our news pages. We don't know what happened. What happened to their families? What has been the reaction? And we've seen some reaction of the police themselves, who've been demonstrating in Peshawar for the last few days. So I think, there's, unfortunately, I can't say that we have one crisis and that is predominantly has to be met up with. We've got multiple crises, which, frankly, we're not dealing with.
Michael, you have an insider-outsider sort of status, so you see Pakistan from the outside, and yet you also have a great deal of insights in Pakistan's domestic political structures. What do you owe this paralysis to in terms of decision-making? Is it because there are there's an opposition party and multiple parties in government that are talking to each other? There's a transition in the military leadership. There is obviously a crisis or a trust deficit in constitutional institutions.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, yes, I think all of those factors are at play. I would also preface my response by noting that, these issues that we're talking about, this steep political polarization, these are clearly not unique to Pakistan. I think that we're in an era, a global era, where you have such deep levels of polarization in so many places, which is fueled by a number of factors. Certainly social media plays a role, but others. You look at how political polarization has played out in my own country over the last few years. It's been quite extraordinary. But in terms of the Pakistan case, I think that part of it comes down to what, to me, and again, as you rightly noted, I'm an outside observer on Pakistan, but what strikes me is this lack of willingness or capacity to truly keep in mind the public interest and the public needs. And that goes to broader issues about how the governing elites, successive governments, have not truly kept in mind the needs of the masses. And that relates to focusing on genuine efforts to bring stronger degrees of education and better access to education, better access to healthcare, and so on and so forth. There seems to be this focus, very insular focus on parochial political needs and concerns. And this has been a story that appears to have played out for years and years, even more so now, and especially over the last few years. And I think certainly, the entrance of Imran Khan and his party into the politics of a country that for many years, during periods of civilian rule, you essentially had two parties that dominated. And I think the entrance of a third party, led by someone who was, I must say, quite adept and talented at exploiting public grievances about corruption and so on. And Khan, of course, has played this role of the populace, which has entailed, really hitting hard, so to speak, at the ruling parties. And I think that has added a new layer of polarization because the established parties have to respond to that. So I think that change in politics is something to note as well.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to sort of take what you said about Imran Khan as a populist, and I want to quote from the book as well. Mr. Barki says that he was with Imran Khan in the book on the campaign trail in 2018, and Imran Khan said, "I am the new Bhutto. My party will sweep the polls much as Bhutto did in 1970. Ahmed Rashid Saab, would you agree with Imran Khan? Is he the new Bhutto?
Sorry, what?
He said, "I'm the new Bhutto. My party will sweep the polls much as Bhutto's did in 1970. He's also made several references to this point, again, in Pakistan's moment in history as potentially being the next 1971. So I'd like you to sort of comment on this.
Well, I think the hallmark of Imran's policy so far have been the U-turns that he's made. The U-turns in policy at almost every level. And that has been more detrimental to the country. I mean, you had a statement saying that the Americans were guilty of trying to throw him out of office, and then you have another statement saying, no, it wasn't the Americans, it was General Bajwa, the former army chief. And you have someone who is maybe extremely populist, but he's not prepared to dialogue with other political forces. And as long as you maintain this position, you are basically a collection of negatives. You're not really thinking of the country at all. I mean, the country in this situation, I think, is probably worse than what we saw in the aftermath of the Bangladesh, the split of East Pakistan from West Pakistan. That was perhaps one of the worst periods of, Pakistanis of my generation that we faced up to. But what we are experiencing now, I think, is much worse than that, because it's a multiple crisis. As I've said, there are three major issues, none of which are being tackled effectively. And everyone is to blame, whether it's the military, the judiciary, and nobody wants to take responsibility. So, there hasn't been also, in my opinion, sufficient public support for a dialogue between the opposition and Imran Khan. And that is, as long as that doesn't happen, we are not going to be free of the IMF. We are going to be tied down to whatever our neighboring states who will provide money in the future, whatever they decide. But we've already seen the Arabs have said quite clearly that until there's some kind of political reconciliation and political alliance, they're not going to give any more money. And they want to see Pakistan sign on the dotted line with the IMF. The Chinese are basically saying the same thing, and they are basically reducing their exposure in Pakistan. So these are Pakistan's allies, and they're pulling out until changes come. And unfortunately, we don't seem to be aware of that.
Michael, again, taking sort of the trend of populism, again, I'm quoting from the book here. There's an interesting comparison that Mr. Barki makes. He says both the BJP in India and PTI in Pakistan have won the trust of the electorate. Again, we're talking about until 2021 when the book was written. The people have voted against the established order. However, the BJP appeals to the Indian extremist Hindu, while the PTI has won the trust of the youth. The BJP is nationalist, while the PTI is internationalist. But, I think that now in 2023, I think Mr. Barki obviously did miss out, and you mentioned, Ahmed Rashid mentioned, how the PTI used anti-Americanism for its, political gain. How different or similar do you think, Michael, is the populism of the BJP, of Narendra Modi and Imran Khan and the PTI?
Yeah, so I imagine that supporters of both parties would not want to admit it, but there are some similar, there are some considerable similarities between the two. But I don't think we should overstate them. For one thing, of course, the the BJP has been around for a long time. It's become more prominent since Modi took over, and it became a very popular party because of Modi's popularity. But of course, the BJP has ruled in the past, whereas PTI, of course, only in 2018, when Khan became prime minister, did it really become a big thing. Of course, the party was formed in 1996, but it really didn't become a major factor in politics until more recently. So I think that's one thing that's different. I think that both parties, and I would disagree with Burki Sahab here, both parties have successfully secured the votes and the support of young people. I think that's quite clear. And it's somewhat ironic that Rahul Gandhi is a few years younger than Modi, to put it mildly, but Modi has certainly won the youth vote over Rahul Gandhi. At any rate, I think that what I see as one of the big differences that, as you had noted, Amber, the BJP's its appeals are very strongly to religion, and I think it's more nationalism than populism for sure. Whereas with the PTI, I think that the appeals are certainly more temporal to a great degree, focused on channeling the grievances of many people because of concerns about corruption, anger at the policies of the US and other Western countries. But also, there are other factors as well. I mean, for quite some time before he realized that economically it wasn't feasible, this notion of an Islamic welfare system that Imran Khan wanted to bring to Pakistan, that's something distinct from those other issues. But I think that where the similarities do lie is the ability of both Khan and Modi to very successfully appeal to and win the support of young people across many bounds, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
Well,
Yes, of course, because I was going to throw that question to you, because I'd like you to respond as well.
Yeah.
We know that they're populist parties, but what are the similarities and differences?
Whose party?
BJP and PTI, Imran Khan, Modi.
Well, I mean, they're very different. I mean, I don't think you can say that they're similar. They're extremely different. Modi has played the religious card to a point where very few other governments have ever done such a thing, whether it's in the West or in Asia. And even our governments, despite the influence of extremism and extreme forms of nationalism, we haven't done that. I think one thing the Indians have achieved far better has been the integration of the minority states, minority ethnic groups, etc., which is something we have not done. At the moment, we are facing the successive Baloch insurgencies, and also what is going on with the Pashtuns and the uprising of the Pakistani Taliban. And now we're seeing more unrest in Sindh for the first time. So, we are failing on all counts, and it's not something that can be resolved by a military rule or something like that. We really need a dialogue, and we need to make these political parties aware that they have to talk to each other.
Go ahead.
Can I just ask Michael, what is Pakistan's status or position in Washington at the moment? I mean, do we have any kind of support or sympathy from the Americans?
Yes, I think that things have certainly changed since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. I certainly think that the strategic outlook in Washington is such that Pakistan is not foremost of mind, to be quite honest. I do think that the floods here last year changed that a bit, in the sense that to the extent that people high up in Washington were thinking about Pakistan, they were really thinking about the floods, and that allowed U.S. policymakers to draw on this long-standing, or this history of the U.S. Moving quickly to provide humanitarian support to Pakistan after natural disasters, including that horrible earthquake many years ago. But no, on the whole, I think if I may be candid, I think that there may be a tendency among some here, and perhaps certainly in Islamabad and in the power corridors, to overstate the importance that Pakistan has in the world, in the sense that, speaking specifically about Washington in this context, Pakistan is not really it's not really a top burner issue from a strategic sense. One quick example, the main U.S. policy in Asia right now is its Indo-Pacific policy. You all know about this policy. It's a policy that, even though this is never mentioned explicitly, it's a policy meant to counter China, not contain China. Oftentimes you hear this notion of the U.S. trying to contain China. It's not. It's trying to counter China. But of course, given Pakistan's long-standing relationship with China, that makes it very difficult for Pakistan to fit into the U.S. Indo-Pacific policies. I think it's found itself, left outside looking in, so to speak. And so given that the main U.S. policy, not just in South Asia, but in Asia on the whole, is a policy focused around the idea of countering China, that really limits the strategic scope here in terms of how the U.S. looks at Pakistan.
And my question was actually going to be related, because I do think China and Pakistan's relationship with China. Let me frame this question for you, Ahmed Rashid Saab. Do you think Pakistan was short-sighted in terms of how important, or what it's relied on its geostrategic location in order to get money, for instance, in order for it to be important on the global stage as well. But its alignment with China, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, India's relationship with the U.S., as well as being seen as a sort of a counter to China, if I may say that. Do you think that Pakistan has really missed the boat a little on where to place itself?
No, I don't think Pakistan has missed the boat, but what I do think is that this has really not been thought through. There is a real dilemma here for Pakistan, which is that it is very dependent on China and needs China for its projects, etc. But at the same time, it needs America because of the international finance institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, etc. And because the military is dependent on the Americans for weapons, for cooperation, etc. But as Michael has said, there is a complete there's a complete failing of the Pakistani establishment to really understand that you have to pursue two policies at the same time: friendship with China and friendship with the Americans. Now that is contradictory, because the Americans are not talking to the Chinese or vice versa, or and one thing, the Americans have made it clear that they support India's denial of help from China, and they don't like exactly what Pakistan is doing. You have the Americans now raising the whole issue of the Muslim Uyghurs in China. You don't have a Muslim state like Pakistan raising this issue. So these are all dilemmas that, frankly, are becoming bigger and bigger for Pakistan. God forbid, if tomorrow there's a conflict between China and the Americans, whose side do we take? And there'll be pressure from both sides to join them. So the tendency would be to say, well, obviously we take China's position. But if we take China's position, the Americans have to only turn a little bit of a screw on our finances or anything else to bring us down. And I think, there's no policy, there's no understanding. We can go on saying that the China is, the standing tall like the mountains of Gilgit, etc., whatever, but we are not really facing reality. We've just made this national strategic paper that was released by the military a few months ago. Frankly, it doesn't deal with any of these important issues. It's a belief that somehow you've discussed your national strategic priorities, but in fact you haven't discussed anything. You haven't posited a new policy at all. And I think this is what I find really amazing, that the amount of money we are spending on the military, on the intelligence, on think tanks, on none of it is producing policies that are rational and believable and that fit in with the international community. Remember, we are extremely isolated at the moment internationally. Nobody is ready to pour in money or support into Pakistan until we come up with a policy.
So it's really up to us. And I know, Michael, that you want to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly to follow on what Ahmed Rashid had to say and what I said earlier. I don't want to risk being perceived as being too oversimplified here. First of all, when you talk about how Pakistan is perceived in Washington, certainly its overall strategic importance hasn't changed in the sense that, Washington continues to look at Pakistan as an important country for the same reasons that it's been considered important for decades. Its location, its population size, number of internal factors, its nuclear weapons, and so on. That's not changed. So I'm not saying that the U.S. does not view Pakistan with any strategic significance at all. What I meant is in the context of America's broader foreign policy goals and its strategic outlook, which is so sharply focused on competition with China, it's there where Pakistan doesn't fit in. But even there, just wanted to clarify, the Biden administration is not essentially closing off all possibilities of cooperation with Pakistan simply because of Pakistan's relationship with China. Contrary to some of the rhetoric that we've seen in the political context here, it is not true that the U.S. is expecting Pakistan to choose whether it aligns itself with the U.S. or China. I mean, I'd argue that, for all intents and purposes, Pakistan is much closer to China than it'll ever be to the U.S. for the foreseeable future. But the U.S. and the Biden administration is clearly interested in trying to figure out ways of reinventing the relationship with Pakistan, even within the limitations of the China factor in this post-U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan world. And so that's why there's been a lot of high-level engagement between the U.S. and Pakistan in recent months, and certainly since the arrival of the new government in Pakistan, which of course will only fuel conspiracies from PTI. But at any rate, there's clearly a desire on the part of the administration to find ways to work with Pakistan, above all on climate change issues. That's a huge priority for the Biden administration. But also on issues like health. One of the first things the new U.S. ambassador here did when he arrived was to announce a new bilateral health dialogue. There have not been many high-level dialogues between the U.S. and Pakistan over the last few years. So that was a good sign. And there's also interest in continuing to talk about how to ramp up trade and investment and so on. So bottom line is, I'm not saying that the U.S. wants to turn its back on Pakistan. That certainly is not the case. But I do think it's important to be realistic and keep expectations modest about what to expect from the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. And of course, I think it's true on the other side as well. Given developments in U.S.-India relations, given that the U.S.-India security partnership is intensifying to the point where now they're in a position where they're starting to implement a series of defense foundational agreements, which means that we're going to see a lot of high quality U.S. military technology and intelligence going to the Indian military, which I imagine is concerning for Pakistan. So both the China and India factors separately constrain expansion of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. So you basically have these geopolitical guardrails, I think, that limit the scope for expanding that relationship.
Ahmed Rashid Saab, I'm going to quote again from the book. The political process in Pakistan, because you have spoken a lot about how nobody's talking to each other. The political process in Pakistan has suffered enormously from the lack of a culture of tolerance and the important democratic tradition of respecting dissent. This has led to a highly polarized pattern of politics and the recurrent breakdown of the democratic process. Relations between the government and the opposition in the recent past have been so tense that their members did not even attend each other's functions. This quote, this comment about the political culture is from November 2000. We seem to be back here again. We seem to be back in this juncture again, where politicians are talking to each other. Do you think that traditionally the military establishment has seen as either, obviously taken over through military coup, has been either an arbiter of sorts, or has favored one political party or the other? Do you think that role has changed or should change, or will change?
Well, I think, for the first time, there's a lot of public criticism of the role of the military, a continuous role of the military in the political process in Pakistan. And there's been a lot of criticism also of the budget that the military takes, and which it insists is needed in order to combat India. But, oh God, sorry. I don't know how to put it off.
नाम भी नहीं लिया था फिर भी आ गया फोन.
I don't know how to put it off. Know how to put it off? Oh God. I'm so sorry.
आप में से कौन फोन कर रहा है?
Sorry. I beg your pardon. I'm really, really sorry. What were we talking about?
Yes, the military establishment and its role in politics.
Yeah, I mean, there's a widespread feeling now among some political forces that the military needs to be brought in to negotiate a peace deal between Imran and the opposition and the government. Now, there's also equal, I think, a number of people who say we don't want the military to interfere anymore. But then who is the arbitrator in this process? Is there anyone who has the political clout and the political standing in the country to be an arbitrator and to be able to bring the two sides together? Unfortunately, the president, the governors of the provinces, the chief ministers, none of them have the clout to be able to play the role which we want them to play. We want the civilians to play the role, not the military. But if the crisis worsens and if what we're seeing now, terrorism has taken a completely new shape with this attack in Karachi after so many years. If we are going to be faced with with all these problems, it's very possible that the military will step in, because what they are seeing is a deterioration of the situation and the lack of a political dialogue. So it's very difficult to say what will happen, but I hope the military does not intervene. I hope the military supports a reconciliation process between the government and the opposition, and without necessarily trying to take over or trying to influence the outcome. I think there was no doubt that we all knew that Imran had been backed very strongly by the military in the last elections. I think that's an open secret now. And Imran himself has admitted it by saying that, I did have the army's backing before. And that has been extremely detrimental, I think, to the polity of Pakistan. And we are now faced with the consequences of that decision taken 3 or 4 years ago.
I'm going to ask my last question of Michael. Michael, what do you think needs to happen first? Do we need to fix the economy first, or does domestic politics need to find some sort of corrective course?
Thanks. A lot of questions about domestic politics for this American, but that's fine. Always happy to do so. I think that clearly there needs to be some type of short-term conciliation or understanding within the political class to allow it to move forward on the economic issue. I mean, clearly, so long as this political polarization, paralysis, whatever you want to call it, plays out, I think it's just going to be very difficult for the government to muster the bandwidth and really the capacity to focus on economic recovery. I think it's quite striking that even now, unless I'm mistaken, there is not even a plan for an economic recovery. It's all focused around the IMF. So, but to get to that point where the government can even think about focusing on the need to put together a plan, the distractions, the noise, all the political stuff needs to be not put on hold, but set aside to the point that you could actually have focus on economic recovery. That may not be possible, quite frankly, until the elections happen. And in that sense, for me, again, as an outside observer of Pakistan, I think a key signpost to me would be when we have a clearer idea of the election calendar. Once we know if the election will indeed take place when it's scheduled to take place, but with all this uncertainty, that just makes things worse, I think. And with reports that have been posted in various places speculating that maybe the election would be postponed or delayed, that certainly would not help things. It certainly would not get the country closer to focusing on economic recovery. And quite frankly, I think that this political uncertainty, the lack of clarity on the election calendar, that could well figure in the IMF's own calculations in terms of how far it's willing to go to help Pakistan. So clearly, bottom line, economic recovery would seem to be the immediate, most important priority. But so long as you have this political paralysis and dysfunction, it seems to be very difficult to get to the point where the government can focus on that immediate priority.
I guess because you're one of the few Americans I know who sort of understands cricket, I thought I'd throw you a googly. But I'm going to stop here my questions. I'd like to open the floor for the audience. I would request that you keep your comments and questions brief so that we can maximize the number of questions. Is there a mic? Could we begin here?
We take 2 or 3 questions together.
We're going to take a few questions together and then we'll have our panelists answer them.
From the geopolitical perspective, we have been forced to see through a certain way and buying oil from Russia on the behalf of both the governments, both the parties, where Iran lies on this stance of the trade of crude oil.
I didn't get that.
Any women who would like to ask questions?
My name is Dr. Jaypal. My question is from both speakers. Why we are failed to stop the cross-border movement from the Afghanistan? We feel we are already overpopulated. We are not polio-free. One factor is from Afghanistan is not polio-free. And terrorism also comes from that. And the dollar, we sometimes say, and the other things are smuggled to the Afghanistan. Why our different governments are not, they have a willpower or the determination to stop this?
There's a lady at the back. Zara पीछे से भी सवाल पूछेंगे.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Mishra. My question is from Michael, sir. You talked about how U.S., Pakistan are like at an all-time low right now, and the significant thing that's tying us together is the Biden administration's willingness to talk about climate change. So would you say that if a Republican government were to come in the United States, that would be really detrimental for Pakistan-U.S. relationships in the longer run?
Should we take the questions or? Yeah, all right, let's. So would you like to address, Ahmed Rashid Saab, would you like to address the Russia, Iran and oil question? And then the other question, I'll ask Michael to ask.
Oil?
Yes.
Well, we have been promoting for a long time a pipeline from Central Asia to Pakistan which would carry gas and fuel. And this was the dream of governments from Ziaul-Haq's period up till now. But it has never been, the dream has never been fulfilled simply because there's been a running war in Afghanistan, which has not been the fault of the Afghans, it's been the fault of the Russians, the Americans, and the Cold War was played out in Afghanistan. But I think we have all equally failed because, you cannot pretend to be building a pipeline. We were in the best position to make peace in Afghanistan if we had wanted to. If you want gas from Turkmenistan and from Uzbekistan, you need to make peace in Afghanistan. Now, as many countries pointed out, Pakistan was in the best position in the 80s, in the 90s, and in this century to have helped to push forward a peace process. And certainly with the Taliban coming in 95, when they took Kabul for the first time, we were promoting ourselves as the do-gooders who will bring about stability in Afghanistan. But we actually did not change our policy. We continued backing the Taliban. We did not support any other forces in Afghanistan. And as a consequence, we somehow landed up with this position as being the spokesman for the Taliban, who came back into power last year in a much more stridently militant Islamic position than they had even before in 95. And unfortunately, the trust that the international community put on us to try and resolve this issue, we weren't able to do it. We weren't capable enough of doing it. So oil and gas has been completely dropped, I think, from the international community intentions to help Pakistan.
There was another question about population. If I could ask you just to repeat the question, sorry.
Too much cross-border coming people from the Afghanistan, and Pakistan is already overpopulated. When Bangladesh was separated, Bangladesh had a more population. Now we have a more population. And the other also things are affected, as we say, the dollar is going to Afghanistan, terrorism is coming. So why our governments are failed to stop the border and restrict this movement?
Would you like to answer that question? It's about...
I just want to say one thing to that. We built this fence to border off Afghanistan from Pakistan. The fence has been a total failure, a total disaster, in fact. Terrorists are coming through and attacking in Pakistan and going back into Afghanistan. The fence has proved to be a bone of major contention now between Pakistan and the Taliban government in Kabul. No Afghan wants to see this fence operational. The fence is being broken down all the time. Now, if you make a policy like that, in which you do not confer with all the parties, all the stakeholders, you don't discuss it with the Karzai government or the Ashraf Ghani government or with even the Taliban, you're going to create enormous resentment. And that's what we've done. People ask me, well, why are the Taliban so angry with Pakistan? Because we've done so much to help them. We've done a lot to help the Afghan population, for sure, as you're saying, with the refugee flow and etc. But we are not being able to cope with the resentment that the Afghans have. We are only building up more resentment amongst the Afghans for Pakistan. And that is really sad.
So I could answer the question about U.S.-Pak relations, but first on this issue of Afghanistan, I think a very important point to acknowledge here. You had talked about how the fencing policy has been problematic and obviously not accepted in Afghanistan. It's important to acknowledge that ever since the establishment of Pakistan in 1947, there has not been a single Afghan government, I believe, including the current Taliban regime, that has accepted the border. I mean, it may be an internationally accepted border in many contexts, but for many in Afghanistan, it's not accepted. And that, I think, has militated against attempts to forge more cooperation around border management and border security, which is a critical issue, and has been for such a long time, particularly in terms of how that impacts cross-border terrorism going both ways. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. It's a really important thing to acknowledge. On U.S.-Pak relations, so just to clarify, if I said this, I didn't mean it, but I certainly was not saying or suggesting that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is at an all-time low. It's definitely not. It's been much worse at many other times in history. There are no crises in U.S.-Pakistan relations now, as there were in 2011, 2012, when there was a new major crisis every few months. The U.S. has not sanctioned Pakistan as it did in the late 90s after it went nuclear. And there's really, quite frankly, there's really no public bashing. There's no, you don't see U.S. officials publicly criticizing Pakistan as it used to be the case. The do more days appear to be a thing of the past right now. And I would argue as well that U.S. frustrations, worries, anxieties about Pakistan have diminished significantly as well. I think that there's, notwithstanding the somewhat peculiar statement that President Biden made some months ago U.S. officials are much less concerned about issues of nuclear safety than had been the case in the past. And the terrorism issue, well, let me restate that. Certainly the U.S. is very concerned about the resurgence of terrorism in Pakistan, but the U.S. is not as concerned about the threat posed by terrorists that threaten and target Americans, simply because the U.S. is out of Afghanistan. The war has ended for now in Afghanistan. So concerns about the Haqqani network and the broader Taliban and their relations with Pakistan, that's no longer relevant because America is out of Afghanistan. So I just wanted to clarify that. But indeed, the relationship is in a tough spot because it's sort of adrift. It's struggling to find new anchors to replace the Afghanistan lens, which had dominated the relationship for so long. So, to your point about if a Republican becomes president, what would that mean for U.S.-Pakistan relations, given that the Biden administration has wanted to place a strong focus on climate change? For one thing, it depends on, if there is a Republican president, it depends on what Republican it is. Some Republicans, especially more moderate Republicans, I think take similar positions on climate change as the Biden administration does. If it's a different Republican, such as the one that had previously been president, maybe things would be different. But even that said, I think that there are a number of other areas of potential cooperation that are more sort of bipartisan in nature. So for instance, I had mentioned that there's very real interest with the Biden administration in figuring out ways how to ensure that bilateral trade continues. There certainly is a desire to look at focusing on more investment. I don't see why a Republican president would feel any differently. And especially if you look at the Indo-Pacific policy, the idea there is to counter China. One thing this administration is trying to do is to find ways to offer its own infrastructure investments in Pakistan, especially through the Development Finance Corporation, meant to counter CPEC and BRI. Very difficult for the U.S. to do that in reality, but that's what it's trying to do. I don't necessarily see why a Republican administration would be opposed to that, especially given that the goal would be to counter China. So bottom line, I think there still would be scope for some forms of cooperation between the U.S. and Pakistan, regardless of which party is in the White House after 2024.
All right, lots of questions. We have a few hands raised over there, so we'll take a couple of questions from over there. We'll go back, we'll go over there.
Hi, this one's for Mike. Mike, welcome to Karachi again. My name is Vijat Khan. I need some clarity on the recent meetings in Washington on the counterterrorism circuit between Pakistan's top brass and the US counterparts. I was wondering what the grapevine in Washington is saying about potential CT cooperation. On the ground here, folks in Pindi seem quite excited that they're back in business and back at it. However, you seem quite skeptical about any potential CT cooperation, especially considering this recent surge of terrorism here, which is being seen by the folks who want to promote robust CT relationship with Washington. They're seeing this as the beginning of a new beginning. So I'm wondering what you're hearing, considering you're just coming in from Washington. Thank you.
There's two more questions there, and then we'll move to this side. We're moving to this side.
So my question's for Michael. You've taken an hour and a half to talk about the domestic issues, but you failed to address the symptom, the actual disease, which was foreign intervention by the U.S. government, was like backed by and pushed by the military-industrial complex. So why is it that you haven't spoken about that and your interference, the interference of your own government in throughout the world, which has been documented through different document leaks, etc. So it's just that. Thank you.
Hi, this is Ramshah Rahman. Okay, I want to talk about.
Could you hold the mic closer?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, this is Ramshah Rahman, and I want to ask you about. First, I'll have a comment, and then I'll ask you the question. Okay, so starting with Afghanistan, we fought the war in Afghanistan for U.S. right against the Soviet. So now I want to ask you about how US see Pakistan in the game of chess as a pawn, because when right now, US has major issues with China and Russia, right? Their close relationship, their increasing relationship between Russia and China is causing problems for US. US shows displeasure on the relationship. Now, Pakistan was close to Afghanistan at the time, close to US at the time when Soviet invaded Afghanistan, and so we were blessed with so many things at that time. Meantime, that was all lost. Now that we are here again, and Pakistan needs US, we won't say support, but we want to know how US actually sees Pakistan in South Asia. We are not strategic partner, right? We are not strategic. So what is the position of Pakistan in South Asia? Is it only just a pawn to counter their diplomatic position against China? Yeah.
Okay, we only have about 5 minutes. I want to take 2 more questions here,
Sure.
and then if you could both.
I hope you got the gist of like.
We understood.
Okay,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Like I said, I need comments and questions to be brief. There are lots of people who want to ask questions. 2 more questions here. The lady in the front and the gentleman in the second row.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Sabiha Mehreen. I am an IR student. So talking about geopolitics, in the regional geopolitics, there is a status quo in South Asia from which Pakistan feels challenged. On the other hand, we also face internal security challenges, as we have seen yesterday's event. So how do you contextualize this? Where are we heading? Can you identify some of research areas? Thank you.
1 more question, second row.
अहमद राशिद साहब से मेरा सवाल है, आपको यहाँ के ज़्यादातर यंग लोग ऑथर के तौर पर और राइटर के तौर पर जानते हैं, लेकिन मेरे नस्ल और तालपुर के अमउम्र लोग आपको एक ऐसे शख्स के तौर पे जानते हैं जो आज से 60 साल पहले पहाड़ों पर तालिबानों की तरह जंग करता था फेडरल गवर्नमेंट के ख़िलाफ़, पाकिस्तान आर्मी के ख़िलाफ़ टू बी मोर स्पेसिफिक। आज जो जंग कर रहे हैं पाकिस्तान आर्मी के ख़िलाफ़, चाहे वो नेशनलिस्ट हों या रिलीजियस एलिमेंट्स हों, उनके लिए क्या पैगाम है? आप मायूस होकर लौट आए थे या वो तरीक़ेकार गलत था? थैंक यू।
I think we'll respond to the questions. If we have time, we may have 1 or 2 more. But Ahmed Saab, जंगजू थे, किताबें लिखते हैं. आप जंगजू थे, अब किताबें लिखते हैं.
I'm a writer and a journalist now. I've had several lives. God has been very kind. I've been, so I gave up one life for another life and for a third life. Now I'm a journalist and getting old doing that. But let me just say, in the 60s, there was a very coherent Marxist movement in Pakistan. You had trade unions, you had student unions, you had a lot of activity as a result largely of Bhutto and what happened to Bhutto with the military. And that led to an upsurge in Marxist thinking. It was also, of course, a global phenomenon. The whole world was having student revolts and student rebellions, etc. And we trumped it by, of course, dealing with Bangladesh in the awful way that we did deal with Bangladesh and the separation of East and West Pakistan. But at that point in time, there was not the idea of splitism or separation. I mean, the Baloch were not talking about creating a separate state. Some of them may have wanted to talk about it, but it was not the general political theme. And same with the Pashtuns. What they wanted was fairness and a fair deal in the whole of Pakistan, which was not possible under the regime of Ayub Khan, followed by Ziaul Haq, etc. And I think what we have seen in both cases is now there's an increasing demand for separation. And that is really very, very dangerous. And we have done nothing. I mean, the killing of Akbar Bukti by the Musharraf regime, for example, set us all back by 20 years. And how can you defend the actions of the state when the state acts in such a violent way? So I think that is this is where we stand now. Separatist movements are growing all across Pakistan, and that is just, in my opinion, a very big danger and something that governments have to help resolve.
I know that the time's up, I'm being told, but very quickly, Michael, there were two questions to you. One, the Pakistan as a pawn, and the other on counter-terrorism efforts and how the boys in Pindi are very excited.
Yeah, so on the U.S.-Pakistan CT talks last week, unfortunately the grapevine in Washington doesn't extend to Karachi, where I've been pretty much since those talks happened. But so far as I understand, there wasn't much of substance in those talks. There was, as I understand it, there was not a lot of discussion about actual thoughts for how to cooperate vis-a-vis countering TTP or Islamic State Khorasan or anything like that. There was not any talk about future U.S. security assistance to Pakistan. There was talk about things like military training programs, things like that. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it actually would be very difficult for the U.S. and Pakistan to launch a new CT alliance. Or any form of substantive new CT cooperation. And keep in mind that all U.S. security aid to Pakistan has been suspended since 2018, and that hasn't changed. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And again, with the U.S. out of Afghanistan, the urgency, I think, is not as strong. Yes, there is that continued focus on building the capacity to project this over-the-horizon ability. We saw that the U.S. was able to pull that out successfully in the operation that eliminated Zawahiri. It's not yet clear who, if anyone, helped the U.S. in that operation. But I don't really think that's a priority right now, quite frankly, the over-the-horizon capacity. So I think that the one thing they may have talked about, and I think here there is some actual possible legs, so to speak, is on the issue of intelligence sharing, broadening the scope for intelligence sharing so that the two can better monitor the location and movement of TTP, ISK in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. Finally, on the issue of
it has to be in one line because my time is up.
Oh, okay. Well, I probably won't answer it then. We could talk afterward because it would take more than one line. Sorry.
All right, so Michael is not committing to whether the Pakistan is a pawn or not. I'm just kidding. Thank you so much, Michael Kugelman, Ahmed Rashid, for your time. I know there's many, many questions. There will be time, I'm hoping, that you could interact with the both of them, as Michael promised as well, and ask them your questions directly. Thank you.